The stage lurched to a violent stop outside the dusty trading post in Llano, Texas, and Eleanor Foster clutched her carpetbag tighter as she peered through the window at the desolate landscape that would become her new home in this unforgiving summer of 1878. She had traveled nearly 3 weeks from Philadelphia, responding to an advertisement for a governess position that promised room, board, and a modest salary in exchange for teaching 3 young boys on a remote cattle ranch. The advertisement had been sparse on details, mentioning only that the children's mother had passed 2 years prior, and their father desperately needed help managing both his land and his sons. Eleanor had nothing left in Philadelphia except memories of her parents' recent deaths from typhoid fever and the small boarding house that had been sold to pay their debts, so she had taken the leap into the unknown with equal parts hope and trepidation. The driver pulled open the door, and Eleanor stepped down into ankle-deep dust that immediately coated her black traveling dress. The heat hit her like a physical force, so different from the humid summers back east. Everything here seemed bleached by the relentless sun. The wooden buildings, the sparse grass, even the sky itself held a washed-out quality that made her squint. A few townspeople moved slowly along the single main street, seeking whatever shade they could find beneath the overhangs of the general store and saloon. Eleanor had expected someone to meet her, but she saw no one who seemed to be waiting for a new arrival. She paid the driver and collected her trunk, dragging it onto the wooden walkway in front of the trading post. Inside, the dim interior offered some relief from the heat. A grizzled man behind the counter looked up from his ledger, his weathered face creasing into something that might have been a smile. "Help you, miss?" he asked. "I am Eleanor Foster. I was supposed to be met here by someone from the Whitmore Ranch. Do you know of it?" The man's expression shifted to something more sympathetic. "Cade Whitmore's place. Yeah, I know it. About 8 miles northwest of here. Cade's a good man, but he has got his hands full with those boys and keeping that ranch running. Lost his wife Sarah to childbirth complications with the youngest one. Tragic business." Eleanor's heart constricted. The advertisement had not mentioned that the mother had died, giving birth to one of the very children Eleanor would be caring for. "Is someone coming for me?" "Should be. Cade's reliable, even if he is stretched thin as wire. Why do not you have a seat? I will send my boy to watch for him." Eleanor settled onto a rough wooden bench, grateful to be off her feet. She had been 23 years old for exactly 1 week, and already her life bore no resemblance to what she had imagined as a girl. She had expected to marry, perhaps to her father's apprentice at the print shop, but then the fever had come, and everything had crumbled. Now she was in Texas, about to become a governess to 3 motherless boys on a ranch in the middle of nowhere. An hour passed, then another. The trading post owner, who introduced himself as Mr. Henderson, brought her water and apologized for the delay. "The ranch life does not always run on schedule," he explained. "Could be a fence broke, or cattle got loose, or any number of things." Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, turning the sky shades of orange and pink that Eleanor had never seen in the industrial haze of Philadelphia, the sound of hoofbeats and wagon wheels approached. Mr. Henderson peered out the window and nodded. "That will be him." Eleanor rose, smoothing her dress and tucking stray auburn hair back into her bun. Her hands trembled slightly, though whether from nervousness or exhaustion, she could not say. She stepped outside and saw a man climbing down from a wagon pulled by 2 sturdy horses. He was tall, probably in his early 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face tanned the color of saddle leather. He moved with the efficiency of someone who had no time to waste, but when he turned and saw her, he stopped abruptly, removing his hat. "Miss Foster?" His voice was deep and carried a slight drawl that marked him as born to this land. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore, I presume?" "Cade Whitmore. I apologize for being late. We had a situation with some steers breaking through the north fence. Took longer to round them up than expected." He studied her for a moment, and Eleanor felt herself being assessed. She was of average height, slender from recent grief that had stolen her appetite, with gray eyes that her mother had always said were too serious for a young woman. She knew she looked plain in her morning dress and travel-worn besides. "I understand. Ranch life must be unpredictable." Something like relief flickered across his face, as if he had expected her to complain. "Hey, let me get your trunk. We need to get back before full dark. The boys are with Maria, our cook, but she has her own family to get home to. Cade lifted her trunk as if it weighed nothing and secured it in the wagon bed. Then he helped Eleanor up onto the seat with a gentle courtesy that surprised her, given his rough appearance. His hands were calloused and strong, but his touch was careful. He climbed up beside her and set the horses moving with a soft click of his tongue. They rode in silence for a while, and Eleanor took in the landscape. It was so vast, so open, that it made her feel simultaneously insignificant and somehow free. The sky stretched forever, unmarked by the buildings and smokestacks that had hemmed in her view back home. The air smelled of dust and sun-baked earth and something green she could not identify. In the distance she could see hills rising, covered in scrub brush and scattered trees. "Tell me about your sons," Eleanor said finally, breaking the silence. Cade's jaw tightened, but after a moment he spoke. "Caleb is the oldest. He's 9. He's the serious one, took on too much responsibility when his mother died. Thomas is 6, and he's the wild one. Gets into everything, never stops asking questions. And James is the baby. He just turned 2 last month. He was the one." Cade's voice trailed off, and Eleanor understood. "The one your wife died birthing." "Yes." The word was clipped, painful. "It is not his fault, but Caleb sometimes looks at him like it is. I do not know how to fix that." Eleanor considered this carefully. Children often need to place blame somewhere when they are hurting. It is easier than accepting that sometimes terrible things just happen. Cade glanced at her, and she saw something like surprise in his dark eyes. "You sound like you know something about that." "I lost both my parents recently. Typhoid fever. I wanted to blame the neighbors who had been sick first, the doctor who could not save them, myself for not being a better nurse. Eventually, I had to accept that sometimes death comes, and there is no one to blame. I am sorry for your loss, and I for yours." They fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now, one born of shared understanding rather than awkward unfamiliarity. The sun sank lower, and the air finally began to cool. Eleanor wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and watched the landscape transform in the fading light. The ranch appeared as they crested a low rise. It was bigger than Eleanor had expected, a main house built of wood and stone, several outbuildings including a large barn, corrals with horses and cattle, and what looked like a bunkhouse in the distance. It was clearly a working ranch, prosperous enough, but with the slightly ragged edges that spoke of a man stretched too thin trying to manage everything alone. As they approached the house, the front door burst open and 2 boys tumbled out, followed by a stout Mexican woman carrying a toddler on her hip. The boys stopped short when they saw Eleanor, suddenly shy. Cade set the brake and jumped down, then came around to help Eleanor descend. "Boys, this is Miss Foster. She's going to be living here and teaching you. I expect you to be respectful and mind her." Cade's voice was firm but not harsh. The older boy, Caleb, stepped forward. He had his father's dark hair and serious expression, though his eyes were lighter, perhaps inherited from his mother. "Hello, Miss Foster." "Hello, Caleb. It is very nice to meet you." The younger boy, Thomas, had lighter hair that stuck up in several directions and a face full of freckles. He grinned at her, revealing a missing front tooth. "Can you cook better than Papa? He burns everything." "Thomas," Cade said warningly, but Eleanor laughed. "I can cook well enough, though I expect Maria is the real expert around here." Maria smiled approvingly and shifted the toddler to her other hip. "This little one is James. He's getting heavy. I need to get home to my own family, Senor Cade." "Of course. Thank you, Maria. I will see you in the morning." Maria handed James to his father and headed toward a wagon hitched near the barn. Cade held his youngest son awkwardly, and James immediately reached for his father's hat, trying to pull it off. The little boy had lighter hair than his brothers, and blue eyes that must have come from his mother. He was beautiful, Eleanor thought, and clearly full of energy even at this late hour. "Let me show you inside," Cade said, still wrestling with James's attempts to grab everything within reach. The house was larger inside than it appeared from the outside. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace on one wall and a long wooden table that could seat 8 or more. Doors led off to what Eleanor assumed were bedrooms. Everything was clean but sparse, functional rather than decorated. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor, none of the small touches that made a house a home. Your room is through here, Cade said, leading her down a short hallway. He pushed open a door to reveal a modest bedroom with a single bed, a dresser, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the ranch yard. It is not much, but it is private. The boys sleep in the room across the hall, all three of them together. My room is on the other side of the house. This is fine, thank you. Cade set James down, and the toddler immediately toddled toward Eleanor, arms outstretched. She instinctively bent down and lifted him, surprised by his ready affection for a stranger. James patted her face with his small hands, studying her seriously. Mama, he said hopefully. Eleanor's heart cracked. She glanced at Cade and saw pain flash across his face. No, James, this is Miss Foster. She's going to help Papa take care of you. Cade's voice was gentle but strained. He does not really remember her, Caleb said from the doorway, his voice flat. He was too little. That's enough, Caleb, Cade said sharply. Help me bring in Miss Foster's trunk. After the trunk was delivered to her room, Eleanor quickly freshened up and then emerged to find chaos in the kitchen. Cade was trying to slice bread while James clung to his leg, and Thomas was chasing a cat around the table while Caleb tried to catch him. Eleanor took in the scene and made a decision. Boys, why do not you show me where things are kept and I will make us some supper? Cade looked relieved. You do not have to. You've been traveling all day. So have you been working all day? Let me help. With the boys' assistance, Eleanor found salt pork, beans that had been soaking, cornmeal, and some vegetables that were past their prime but still usable. She set to work, and within an hour they were sitting around the table eating a simple but hot meal. It was not fancy, but it was better than whatever Cade had been planning, and the boys ate hungrily. This is really good, Thomas declared through a mouthful of beans. Do not talk with your mouth full, Caleb corrected automatically. Eleanor smiled. Thank you, Thomas. And Caleb is right about the manners. After supper, Cade carried James, who was falling asleep on his feet, to bed, while Eleanor supervised Caleb and Thomas washing up. The boys changed into nightshirts and climbed into the large bed they shared with their baby brother. Eleanor tucked the quilts around them, feeling a surprising rush of affection for these children she had only just met. Will you read to us? Thomas asked hopefully. Not tonight. It has been a long day for all of us, but tomorrow evening, if you have books, I would be happy to read. Mama used to read to us every night, Caleb said quietly, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed. I am not here to replace your mother, Caleb. No one could do that. But I am here to take care of you and your brothers, and I promise I will do my very best. Caleb looked at her then, really looked at her, and Eleanor saw the weight he carried in those young eyes. Papa tries, but he is always so busy. And Maria is nice, but she has to leave. I know. That is why I'm here now. You do not have to manage everything by yourself anymore. Something in Caleb's expression softened slightly. Good night, Miss Foster. Good night, boys. Eleanor found Cade in the main room, staring into the empty fireplace. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped with fatigue that seemed to go beyond the physical. They are good boys, Eleanor said softly. Cade straightened. They are. They deserve better than what I have been able to give them the past 2 years. You have kept them fed, clothed, and safe. That is no small thing. But they need more than that. They need someone who has time to actually talk to them, teach them, pay attention to them. I'm so busy keeping this ranch running that some days I barely see them except at meals. Eleanor moved closer, keeping a respectful distance but wanting him to hear her clearly. That's why I'm here now. You can focus on the ranch, and I will focus on the boys. We will manage together. Cade met her eyes, and Eleanor felt something shift between them. Some understanding reached without words. Thank you, Miss Foster. I know this is not what you probably imagined when you left Philadelphia. Life rarely is what we imagine, but that does not mean it cannot be good. The next days settled into a rhythm. Eleanor woke early, made breakfast for the family, and then spent the morning teaching the boys their lessons. She discovered quickly that Caleb was bright and studious, already reading at a level beyond his years. Thomas struggled with sitting still, but had a quick mind when something captured his interest. James was into everything, requiring constant supervision, but his sunny disposition made the chaos almost enjoyable. In the afternoons, Eleanor worked on the house. She made curtains from fabric she found in a trunk that had belonged to Sarah Whitmore. She scrubbed floors, organized the chaotic kitchen, and started a vegetable garden near the house. The physical work felt good after years of more sedentary life in the city. Cade was gone most of each day, working with his small crew of ranch hands to manage the cattle, repair fences, break horses, and handle the 1,000 tasks that kept a ranch running. But he came in for the midday meal that Eleanor prepared, and he was always there for supper. Eleanor noticed how he watched his sons during meals, drinking in their presence even as exhaustion lined his face. 3 weeks after Eleanor's arrival, a summer storm rolled in one evening, bringing violent wind and driving rain. The boys were frightened by the thunder, and Eleanor gathered them close in the main room, telling them stories to distract them from the noise. James clung to her, his small fingers twisted in her dress, and she rocked him gently. Cade came in soaked through, having been securing the barn and animals. He stopped when he saw Eleanor with all 3 boys gathered around her, Thomas leaning against her side, while she held James and Caleb sat close enough to hear her story. The look on his face was complex, gratitude, sadness, and something else Eleanor could not quite name. She finished her story and got the boys settled for bed despite the storm's continuing rage. When she returned to the main room, Cade had changed into dry clothes and was standing by the window, watching the rain. "Coffee?" Eleanor asked. "Please?" She poured them both cups from the pot on the stove and joined him at the window. The storm was beautiful in its violence, lightning illuminating the landscape in brilliant flashes. "They have not seemed that calm during a storm since Sarah died," Cade said quietly. "She was always good at making them feel safe. They are good boys. They just needed someone to pay attention to them." Cade turned to look at her. "You're doing more than I hired you for. The house, the cooking, the garden. I only expected you to teach them and keep an eye on them." Eleanor shrugged. "I like keeping busy, and this place needed a woman's touch." "It did," Cade agreed. "I let it go after Sarah died. Could not bring myself to care about curtains or rugs or any of that. But now, seeing what you have done, I realize how much was missing." They stood in companionable silence, drinking their coffee and watching the storm. Eleanor was acutely aware of Cade's presence beside her, the warmth of him in the cool air brought by the rain, the subtle scent of leather and horses and something uniquely him. She had not expected to feel drawn to this rough cowboy, but she found herself thinking about him at odd moments during the day, wondering if he would like the meal she was preparing, or noticing how his rare smiles transformed his serious face. "Tell me about her," Eleanor said impulsively. "About Sarah." Cade was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he would not answer, but finally he spoke. "We grew up together. Her father had the ranch next to my family's place. We always knew we would marry. She was good and kind and patient with my moods. She loved this land as much as I did. When she got pregnant with James, we were so happy. We already had our 2 boys, but she wanted a daughter. When the midwife said it was another boy, Sarah just laughed and said she was meant to raise cowboys." His voice cracked. The bleeding would not stop. By morning she was gone. Eleanor reached out without thinking and took his hand. Cade looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face. "I am sorry," Eleanor said. "I know those words do not help much, but I am truly sorry." "Thank you." Cade did not pull his hand away. "What about you? Was there anyone in Philadelphia?" "No. My father was sick for a long time before he died, and then my mother went quickly after. There was a young man who worked for my father, and I think we might have eventually married. But when my parents died, and I had nothing, he married someone else. I do not blame him. He needed to think practically." "That is cold," Eleanor smiled sadly. "That is life sometimes. But it brought me here, and I think maybe this is where I was supposed to be." Cade's thumb brushed across her knuckles, and Eleanor felt the touch like electricity. She looked up and found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment she thought he might say something, but then a crack of thunder made them both jump, and the moment broke. "I should check the barn one more time," Cade said, releasing her hand. "Make sure everything is secure." "Be careful." He grabbed his slicker and headed back out into the storm. Eleanor stood at the window, her hand still warm from his touch, and wondered what was happening between them. She was the governess, the employee. He was her employer, still mourning his wife. But there was something growing between them, something Eleanor had never felt before, not even with the young man in Philadelphia who was supposed to have been her future. The summer deepened, and the heat became oppressive. Eleanor learned to work in the early mornings and late evenings, resting during the worst of the midday sun. The boys browned like little nuts despite her efforts to keep them in hats. James took his first real steps without holding on to anything, and everyone celebrated. Thomas caught his first fish in the creek that ran through the property. Caleb began to smile more, the weight he carried easing bit by bit. And Eleanor fell more deeply for Cade Whitmore with each passing day. It was in the small things, how he always thanked her for meals, how he listened patiently to Thomas's endless questions, how he ruffled Caleb's hair when he thought no one was watching, how he sang softly to James when the little boy could not sleep. It was in the way he looked at Eleanor across the supper table, his eyes holding conversations they did not dare speak aloud. It was in the accidental touches when they both reached for something at the same time, the way they found excuses to stand near each other. One evening in late August, after the boys were in bed, Eleanor was sitting on the porch trying to catch any hint of breeze. Cade joined her, sitting on the step below her, and they watched the stars emerge in the vast Texas sky. "I got a letter today from Sarah's parents," Cade said. "They want to come visit, meet James properly since they have only seen him as a newborn. See how the other boys are doing." "That is good, is it not?" "Yes and no, they are good people, but seeing them reminds me of everything we lost, and they will judge how I am managing, whether I am doing right by the boys." Eleanor felt a flash of anxiety. "Will they disapprove of me being here?" Cade turned to look up at her. "No. If anything, they will be relieved. Sarah's mother has been after me to find help for years now." "When are they coming?" 3 weeks. I need to get the house in better shape, fix some things that have been waiting." "The house looks fine, Cade. I have been working on it all summer." "I know. You have transformed it. I just want everything to be right." They sat quietly for a moment, and then Cade spoke again, his voice low. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something." Her heart began to beat faster. "What is it?" "These past months with you here, watching you with my sons, seeing how you have brought life back to this house, I have felt something I did not think I would feel again. I know it is not appropriate. You are my employee, and I am probably taking advantage by even speaking of this, but I cannot keep pretending I do not feel it." Eleanor's hands trembled. "What do you feel, Cade?" He stood and turned to face her, his expression earnest in the starlight. "I'm falling in love with you. Maybe I have been since that first night when you took James and made him stop crying, when you understood about Caleb carrying too much weight. You have given my sons something I could not give them, but more than that, you have given me something I thought I had lost forever. Hope, joy, the feeling that life could be more than just surviving each day." Eleanor stood as well, her heart full to bursting. "I love you too, Cade." I tried not to. I told myself it was impossible, that I was just the governess, that you were still in love with your wife. But I cannot help it. I love you, and I love your sons like they were my own." Cade reached for her, pulling her into his arms, and Eleanor went willingly. His kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if he was afraid she might disappear. But Eleanor returned it with all the pent-up longing of the past months, and Cade deepened the kiss, his hands cradling her face like she was something precious. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Cade rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me, Eleanor. Not because the boys need a mother, though they do. Not because I need help with the ranch, though I do. But because I love you and I want you beside me for the rest of my life." "Yes," Eleanor said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you." They stood wrapped in each other's arms under the vast Texas sky, and Eleanor marveled at how much her life had changed in just a few months. She had come to Texas expecting only employment, a way to survive after losing everything. Instead, she had found a new family, a new home, and a love deeper than she had imagined possible. The next morning at breakfast, Cade cleared his throat and got the boys' attention. "Boys, I have something to tell you. I have asked Miss Foster to marry me, and she has said yes. She's going to become your mother, if that's all right with you." Caleb looked between them, his serious young face thoughtful. "Will she still teach us?" "Of course," Eleanor said. "And she will stay here always?" Thomas asked. "She will not go away?" "I will stay here always," Eleanor promised, her throat tight with emotion. James, not really understanding what was happening but picking up on the emotions in the room, clapped his hands and shouted, "Mama!" Caleb stood up from the table and walked over to Eleanor. He looked up at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I am glad you are staying. I know you are not our real mother, but you feel like one. Is that all right?" Eleanor knelt down and pulled Caleb into a hug, then opened her arms for Thomas and James to join. "That is more than all right, sweetheart. That is everything." They were married 3 weeks later, just before Sarah's parents arrived. It was a simple ceremony in town at the small church, with Mr. Henderson and Maria as witnesses. Eleanor wore a new dress made of blue calico that matched her eyes, and Cade wore his best suit, which smelled of cedar from the trunk where it had been stored. The boys stood with them, scrubbed clean and looking impossibly young and serious. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Cade kissed Eleanor with tender reverence, and she heard Thomas giggle. Eleanor turned and saw all 3 boys grinning at them, and her heart felt full enough to burst. The reception was held at the ranch, with neighbors Eleanor had barely met arriving with food and well wishes. Maria had outdone herself with the cooking, and there was music and dancing as the sun set over the Texas hills. Eleanor danced with Cade with his ranch hands, even with little Thomas, who stood on her feet and let her waltz him around. When Sarah's parents arrived the next day, Eleanor felt a flutter of nervousness. John and Martha Reynolds were in their late 50s, weathered by ranch life, but still strong. They climbed down from their wagon and stood looking at the house, clearly seeing their daughter in every corner of the place. Cade introduced Eleanor simply. "This is my wife, Eleanor. We were married yesterday." Martha Reynolds studied Eleanor with sharp eyes, and Eleanor forced herself to stand tall and meet that gaze. Finally, Martha's expression softened. "Sarah loved this house. I'm glad it has a woman caring for it again." Relief flooded through Eleanor. "Would you like to come inside? The boys are eager to see you." The visit went better than Eleanor had dared hope. The Reynolds were clearly grieving people, still carrying the loss of their only daughter, but they were not bitter. They doted on James, marveling at how much he had grown, and caught up with Caleb and Thomas. At supper that night, Martha pulled Eleanor aside. "I can see what you have done here," the older woman said. "Not just the house, though it looks better than it has in years. But the boys, they are happy again. And Cade, he has light in his eyes that I thought we would never see again." "I love them all very much," Eleanor said simply. Martha squeezed her hand. "I can see that. Sarah would have liked you, I think. She would have been glad knowing her boys were loved." The Reynolds stayed for a week, and by the time they left, Eleanor felt that she had gained not just a husband and sons, but a family that stretched back and forward through time. She stood with Cade and the boys, waving as the wagon disappeared down the dusty road, and then they all went back inside their home. That night, after the boys were asleep, Eleanor and Cade lay in the bed they now shared, talking quietly in the darkness. It was their first real night together as husband and wife, as the Reynolds had occupied the room the past week, and Eleanor had stayed in her old room. "Are you happy?" Cade asked, running his fingers through her unbound hair. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be," Eleanor answered honestly. "Are you?" "More than I deserve to be." Cade pulled her closer. "I thought after Sarah died that I would spend the rest of my life just existing, going through the motions. I never expected to love again." "Do you feel guilty about it?" Eleanor asked softly, needing to know. Cade was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes. But then I remember that Sarah loved life, loved joy. She would not have wanted me to stay frozen in grief forever. And she would have loved knowing that her boys have a mother who adores them. I do adore them. When James calls me Mama, my heart swells so much I think it might burst. When Thomas shows me a bug he found and is so proud, I feel proud too. When Caleb reads to me and I see his mind working through complex ideas, I am in awe of him. They are my sons now, in every way that matters." "And what about their father?" Cade asked, a hint of teasing in his voice. "How do you feel about him?" Eleanor smiled in the darkness and kissed him. "Their father is the best man I have ever known, strong and kind and patient, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life showing him how much I love him." Their lovemaking that night was tender and passionate, a joining not just of bodies but of hearts and lives. Afterward, Eleanor lay in Cade's arms and listened to his breathing, slow as he fell asleep. She sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the unexpected path that had brought her to this place. The seasons turned, and fall brought relief from the brutal summer heat. The ranch work continued in its endless cycle, but now Eleanor was fully part of it. She learned to churn butter, preserve vegetables, help with the chickens, and even assist with minor medical care for the animals. The boys continued their lessons, and Eleanor marveled at how they grew and changed. Caleb was becoming a fine young man, taking on more responsibility around the ranch and showing an interest in the business side of things. Thomas remained wild and energetic, but was learning to channel that energy into useful work. And James, at 2.5, was talking in full sentences and getting into more trouble than all his brothers combined. One crisp November evening, Eleanor realized she had missed her monthly courses. She said nothing at first, not wanting to raise hopes prematurely, but when another month passed, she knew. She was carrying Cade's child. She told him one night after the boys were in bed. Cade had been going over the ranch accounts at the kitchen table, and Eleanor came to stand beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Cade, I need to tell you something." He looked up, immediately alert to the serious tone in her voice. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I'm fine, better than fine. I'm expecting a baby." The expression that crossed Cade's face was a mixture of joy and fear. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be. I think the baby will come in June, around James's birthday." Cade stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "Eleanor, I'm so happy, but I'm also terrified. After what happened with Sarah, I know, I am scared too, but I'm also strong, and we will have the doctor come from town when the time gets close. We will do everything right." "I cannot lose you," Cade said fiercely. "I cannot. You will not. I promise you, I'm going to be fine, and we are going to have a healthy baby." They told the boys the next day. Caleb looked worried, clearly remembering his mother's death, but he tried to smile. Thomas was excited, already planning all the things he would teach the baby. James did not fully understand, but picked up on the excitement and clapped his hands. Over the next months, Eleanor's belly grew round, and the baby made its presence known with strong kicks and rolls. Cade was attentive to the point of being overprotective, insisting Eleanor rest more and take on less work. She tolerated his fussing because she knew it came from love and fear. The boys were wonderful. Caleb helped with chores that had been Eleanor's, taking over with a maturity beyond his 10 years. Thomas was gentler with her, remembering not to crash into her with his usual exuberance, and James would put his little hand on her belly and laugh when the baby kicked, calling it his baby. In May, as Eleanor grew increasingly uncomfortable in the spring heat, Cade sent for the doctor to come stay at the ranch. Dr. Thornton was an older man who had delivered half the babies in the county, and his calm presence eased some of Cade's fears. Eleanor went into labor on a warm June evening, just as they were finishing supper. The boys were sent to stay with Maria's family in town, despite Thomas's protests that he wanted to stay and help. Cade refused to leave Eleanor's side, holding her hand through each contraction, wiping her forehead with cool cloths and whispering encouragement. The labor was long and hard, and there were moments when Eleanor understood Cade's fear. But Dr. Thornton was skilled and patient, and as dawn broke over the ranch, Eleanor gave birth to a healthy baby boy with a lusty cry that announced his arrival to the world. "You have a son," Dr. Thornton said, placing the baby in Eleanor's arms. Cade was crying, Eleanor realized, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his wife and new son. "You did it. You're all right. Oh God, Eleanor, you are all right." "I told you I would be," Eleanor said, exhausted but triumphant. She looked down at the baby in her arms, this child of her body, and felt love wash over her. "Hello, little one. We have been waiting for you." They named him Kenneth, after Cade's father, with the middle name Foster to honor Eleanor's family. He had dark hair like his father and brothers, but Eleanor's gray eyes. When the boys came home and met their new brother, the joy on their faces was everything Eleanor could have hoped for. Caleb held Kenneth carefully, studying his tiny face with wonder. "He is so small. Was James this small?" "Even smaller," Cade said. "You were all this small once." Thomas peered at the baby with interest. "When can he play with me?" "Not for a while yet," Eleanor said with a laugh, "but eventually he will have 3 big brothers to teach him everything." James climbed up on the bed next to Eleanor and patted the baby's head with surprising gentleness. "My baby," he declared. "All of ours," Eleanor agreed, looking around at her family with a heart so full it ached. The first year of Kenneth's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and endless work, but it was shot through with moments of piercing joy. Eleanor would never forget the first time Kenneth smiled at her, or the day he laughed at Thomas making faces, or the way Caleb would read to him with such patience. James was fascinated by his little brother, always wanting to help, bringing him toys and patting him when he cried. Cade was a devoted father, splitting his time between the ranch work that never ended and the family that was his heart. Eleanor would catch him sometimes just watching them all, the five of them together, and she would see the wonder in his face that this was his life now. One evening, when Kenneth was about 8 months old, the whole family was gathered in the main room after supper. Thomas was showing off a trick he had taught the dog, Caleb was reading, James was building something with blocks, and Eleanor was nursing Kenneth. Cade came in from checking the barn for the night and stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene. Eleanor caught his eye and smiled. He came over and kissed the top of her head, then Kenneth's, before settling into his chair with a contented sigh. "Papa, watch this," Thomas called, and Cade turned his attention to his son's antics. This was their life now, Eleanor thought, not perfect, still marked by the sorrows they had endured, but full and rich and overflowing with love. She had come to Texas thinking she would teach 3 motherless boys, and instead had found herself becoming a mother, a wife, and a woman more complete than she had ever been in Philadelphia. The years flowed past like water in the creek, each season bringing its own challenges and gifts. The ranch prospered under Cade's management, and they were able to hire more help, which gave him more time with the family. Eleanor continued teaching the boys, and when Kenneth was old enough, he joined his brothers at the kitchen table for lessons. Caleb grew into a fine young man, graduating from Eleanor's teaching and eventually going to San Antonio for further schooling. He returned to the ranch with knowledge of new ranching techniques and business practices that helped expand the operation even more. Thomas remained the wild one, but he channeled that energy into becoming the best horseman in the county, training and breaking horses with a skill that was sought after by neighboring ranchers. James grew into a thoughtful boy with his mother, Sarah's kind heart, always the first to help anyone in need. And Kenneth, born of Eleanor's body but shaped by the whole family, was a bridge between his older brothers and any future siblings. When he was 3, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, after Cade's first wife. It felt right to honor her that way, to ensure the boys never forgot the mother who had given them life. Little Sarah had her father's dark hair and her mother's eyes, and she was doted on by all her older brothers. 2 years after Sarah came another daughter, Martha, named for Sarah's mother, who had passed away the previous winter. The house that had once been silent and sad was now filled with the noise and chaos of a large, loving family. Through it all, Eleanor and Cade's love for each other only deepened. They had their disagreements, of course, the inevitable friction of 2 strong-willed people building a life together. But they had learned to talk through their problems, to listen to each other, to forgive and move forward. One summer evening when Eleanor was 35 and Cade was 42, they sat on the porch watching the sunset as they had done countless times before. The children were all occupied with their own activities. Caleb was working on the ranch accounts, Thomas was in the barn with the horses, James was playing with Sarah and Martha in the yard, and Kenneth was reading under a tree. "Do you ever think about that day when you arrived?" Cade asked, taking Eleanor's hand. "When I picked you up at the trading post?" "All the time," Eleanor said. "I was so scared. Everything I had known was gone, and I was heading into this completely unknown situation." "I was scared too," Cade admitted. "I had no idea if I was doing the right thing, bringing a stranger into my home around my boys. I just knew I was drowning and needed help. And look at us now." Eleanor gestured at the scene before them, the prosperous ranch, the happy children, the life they had built together. "I could not have done any of this without you," Cade said. "You saved us, Eleanor. You saved me." "We saved each other," Eleanor corrected. "I had nothing and nowhere to go. You gave me a purpose, a family, a home. And then you gave me your heart, which was the greatest gift of all." Cade leaned over and kissed her, a sweet kiss that still carried the spark of the passion they shared. "I love you, Mrs. Whitmore." "I love you too," Eleanor said, resting her head on his shoulder. As the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had lost so much: her parents, her home, the life she had expected to live. But in losing all that, she had found something far greater. She had found a cowboy who needed her, 3 sons who needed a mother's care, and in giving them her love, she had discovered a capacity for joy she had never known she possessed. The children called them in for supper, and Eleanor and Cade rose, hands still linked, and went inside to the noise and warmth of their family. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, the ranch work that never ended, the children who would need attention and guidance, the 1,000 small tasks that made up a life. But tonight, they were all together, safe and loved and happy. And that, Eleanor thought as she looked around the table at all the faces she loved, was more than enough. It was everything. Years continued to pass, each one adding new layers to their family story. Caleb eventually married a woman from San Antonio, a schoolteacher named Anne, who reminded Eleanor of herself. They built a house on the far corner of the Whitmore Ranch and started their own family, giving Eleanor and Cade their first grandchildren. Thomas married the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a spirited woman who could ride as well as he could, and they settled into a life of raising horses and children in equal measure. James surprised everyone by falling in love with the new schoolteacher in town, a quiet woman who shared his kind heart. They married when James was 23 and she was 21, and they took over teaching the next generation of Llano children, including their own. Kenneth grew up to become the backbone of the main ranch operation, working alongside his father and eventually taking over more and more of the day-to-day management as Cade aged. He married a woman from Austin who had come to visit her aunt in Llano, and they raised their children in the main house, which was expanded to accommodate the growing family. Sarah, the daughter who bore her predecessor's name, grew into a beautiful and capable young woman who managed the household with grace and efficiency. When she married a young lawyer from town, Cade built them a house within sight of the main ranch house, unable to stand the thought of his daughter being too far away. Martha, the youngest, was the wild one, inheriting Thomas's spirit and Cade's stubbornness. She shocked the family by announcing she wanted to go to nursing school in San Antonio. And though Cade initially resisted, Eleanor talked him around. Martha became a nurse and eventually returned to Llano, where she established a small clinic and married the town doctor, a widower 20 years her senior who adored her fierce spirit. Through all these years and changes, Eleanor remained the heart of the family. She was the one everyone came to with their problems, their joys, their fears. She was grandmother to a growing brood of grandchildren, mother to 6 children who adored her, and wife to the man who still looked at her like she hung the moon. On Eleanor's 50th birthday, the family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. It was a warm spring day, perfect for the barbecue and games that were planned. Eleanor stood on the porch, watching the controlled chaos unfold before her, children running everywhere, adults laughing and talking, the smoky smell of cooking meat filling the air. She counted heads almost unconsciously, a habit from years of keeping track of her children, and marveled at how many people now made up her family. Cade came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about? How far we have come. How much has changed. Any regrets?" Eleanor turned in his arms so she could see his face. At 57, Cade's hair was more silver than dark, and his face bore the deep lines of a man who had spent his life outdoors. But his eyes still held the same warmth and love they had that first night he kissed her under the stars. "Not a single one," Eleanor said firmly. "I would not change anything, even the hard parts, because they all led us here." "Even the part where you were terrified to meet me?" Eleanor laughed. "Especially that part. If I had not been scared, I might not have been brave." "You have always been brave," Cade said, "from the moment you stepped off that stage and into this life." Their oldest son, Caleb, now 33 years old and a father himself, came up the porch steps with his own son perched on his shoulders. "Mama, Grandmother Martha sent you a letter. She said to read it when you have a quiet moment." Eleanor took the letter, recognizing the shaky handwriting of her mother-in-law, who was now 85 and still living on her own ranch with the help of her son and his family. She tucked it into her pocket to read later and smiled at her grandson. "Are you having fun, David?" "Grandpa promised to let me ride his horse later," the boy said excitedly. "Did he now?" Eleanor looked at Cade, who had the grace to look slightly sheepish. "He is old enough," Cade defended. "He is 5, Eleanor pointed out, but she was smiling. She had learned long ago to pick her battles, and Cade was wonderful with the grandchildren. He would keep David safe. As the party continued, Eleanor found herself surrounded by the evidence of the life she had built. Thomas was teaching several of the older grandchildren a rope trick. James was helping his wife serve the food with their characteristic teamwork. Kenneth was deep in conversation with Caleb about some ranch matter, their heads together in the same way Cade's and Caleb's used to be. Sarah was organizing games for the younger children with efficient grace, and Martha had just arrived with her husband and their 2 children, breathless from the ride in from town. Eleanor's 3 oldest sons, the boys who had needed a mother's care when she first arrived 27 years ago, had become the men she was most proud of in the world. They were good husbands, devoted fathers, and productive members of their community. And they still called her Mama, still came to her for advice, still looked at her with love. Later, after the guests had gone home and the house had quieted down, Eleanor sat in her bedroom and opened the letter from Martha Reynolds. Her mother-in-law's words were shaky but heartfelt. "Dear Eleanor," the letter read, "as I sit here on what may be my last birthday, I wanted you to know what a blessing you have been to our family. When Sarah died, I thought we had lost everything. The light went out of Cade's eyes, and those precious boys were adrift. But then you came, and slowly, the light returned. You did not try to replace Sarah. You honored her memory while building your own place in that family's heart. You gave Cade love again, gave the boys a mother's care, and gave John and me the peace of knowing our grandsons were cherished. Thank you for loving them all so well. Thank you for being exactly what they needed. With all my love, Martha." Eleanor wiped tears from her eyes as Cade came into the room. "What is it? Bad news?" "No, the best news. Read this." Cade read the letter, and Eleanor saw his own eyes grow moist. "She is right, you know. You were exactly what we needed. What I needed." "I needed you too," Eleanor said. "I was lost. Cade. Alone and scared and with no idea where my life was going. And then I found you and the boys, and suddenly I had a purpose, a reason to get up in the morning, people to love and who loved me back." They sat together on their bed, holding hands as they had so many times over the years, and Eleanor felt the peace that came from a life well lived. She thought about the young woman who had stepped off that stage in Llano 27 years ago, clutching her carpetbag and terrified of the future. If she could go back and tell that girl what lay ahead, what would she say? She would say, "Be brave. Say yes to the cowboy with sad eyes and 3 motherless sons. Open your heart even though you are scared. Love them with everything you have. Because in giving your heart away, you will find it multiplied beyond measure." The seasons continued their endless cycle, and the ranch prospered. Eleanor and Cade grew older, their hair silver, their steps slower, but their love unchanged. They had lived through droughts and floods, good years and bad, births and deaths, joy and sorrow. Through it all, they had each other and the family they had built together. When Cade was 65, he stepped back from active management of the ranch, turning it over to Kenneth while remaining available for advice and guidance. Eleanor was glad to have him around more, to spend quiet mornings drinking coffee together and watching the sunrise, to take evening walks when the heat had passed, to simply be together without the pressure of all the responsibilities they had carried for so long. One evening when Eleanor was 58, they stood on their porch watching the newest generation of Whitmore children playing in the yard. There were so many grandchildren now that Eleanor sometimes lost count, and great-grandchildren were starting to arrive as Caleb's oldest children began marrying. "Do you ever miss Philadelphia?" Cade asked, a question he had never asked before in all their years together. Eleanor thought about it carefully. "I miss my parents sometimes. I wish they could have met you and the children, could have seen the life I built here. But miss the city itself? No. This is my home. It has been since the day I arrived. You never talk about it much. Your life before. Because this is my real life. Everything before was just preparation for finding you, for finding my place here." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "I became myself here, Cade. The real Eleanor, not the shadow I was in Philadelphia. I know what you mean, Cade said. After Sarah died, I was just going through the motions. I was not really living. But then you came, and slowly I remembered what it felt like to truly be alive, to feel joy again, to hope for the future instead of just enduring the present. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the children play, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling in for the evening, cattle lowing, horses neighing, the windmill creaking as it turned. These were the sounds that had become Eleanor's lullaby, the soundtrack of her life. "We built something good here," Eleanor said. "Look at all these children, Cade. Our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. They are all here because we found each other, because we were brave enough to love again after loss. Because you were brave enough to take a chance on a broken cowboy and his 3 wild boys," Cade corrected. "They were never wild. They were just lost, like their father. Like me." Eleanor turned to face Cade fully. "We found each other, and we built this life together. That is what I'm most proud of. Not the ranch's success, not the size of our family, but the fact that we did it together. We were partners in everything." Cade pulled her close, and Eleanor rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. It was slower than it used to be, as was hers, but it was steady and strong. They had many years left, she hoped, to enjoy the life they had built. As the sun set over the Texas hills, painting the sky in the brilliant colors that never ceased to amaze Eleanor, the family began gathering for supper. It was Sunday, the day they all tried to come together for a meal, and the big house was soon filled with people and noise and laughter. Eleanor looked around the table at all the faces, seeing pieces of herself in Cade and Sarah in each one. Caleb had his father's serious demeanor and his first mother's kind heart. Thomas had inherited Cade's love of the land and Eleanor's teaching gift, which he used training both horses and young ranch hands. James was like Sarah in his quiet compassion, but had Eleanor's love of learning. Kenneth was pure Cade in looks and temperament, but had Eleanor's organizational skills. Sarah had her namesake's beauty and Eleanor's practical nature. And Martha, the baby, had somehow gotten the best and most stubborn traits from everyone. "What are you thinking about, Mama?" Kenneth asked from his seat beside her. Eleanor smiled. "Just counting my blessings." "Must take a while with all of us," Thomas joked from across the table. "Every minute is worth it," Eleanor said, and she meant it. After supper, as the family began to disperse to their various homes, Eleanor and Cade walked out to the cemetery plot on the hill behind the house. Sarah Whitmore's grave was there, marked by a simple stone that read, "Beloved wife and mother." Eleanor had tended this grave as faithfully as she had tended Sarah's sons, keeping it clear of weeds and placing wildflowers on it regularly. "Do you think she would approve?" Cade asked, as he sometimes did when they visited the grave. "Of us? Of everything?" "I think she would be glad her boys had someone to love them," Eleanor said. "I think she would be grateful that you found happiness again. And I hope she knows that I have never tried to erase her memory, only to build on the foundation she laid." They stood in silence for a moment, paying respects to the woman whose death had, in a strange way, brought Eleanor to this place and this life. Then they walked back to the house together, arms around each other, their steps matching as they had learned to do over nearly 3 decades of marriage. That night, lying in bed with Cade's arms around her, Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her here. From Philadelphia to Llano, from governess to wife and mother, from lost and alone to surrounded by love and family. It had not always been easy. There had been hard years, drought years when they had worried about money and rain. There had been childhood illnesses that terrified her, the normal conflicts and struggles of raising children, the adjustments required as the family grew and changed. But through it all, there had been love. Love had been the foundation on which everything else was built. Her love for Cade, and his for her. Their love for the children's love for each other, it had sustained them through every challenge and made every triumph sweeter. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Cade asked sleepily. "For everything. For taking a chance on a frightened woman from Philadelphia. For letting me love your sons. For loving me back. For building this life with me." Cade's arms tightened around her. "Thank you for coming to Texas. Thank you for staying. Thank you for making our house a home. Thank you for being the best mother my boys could have asked for and the best wife I could have dreamed of." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other as they had been for thousands of nights, as they would be for thousands more if they were blessed with the time. And Eleanor's last thought before sleep claimed her was that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, with exactly the people she was supposed to be with. She had found her home, her purpose, her great love. And it had all started with 3 sons who needed a mother's care and a broken cowboy who needed someone to help him heal. In the morning, Eleanor woke to the familiar sounds of the ranch coming to life and the warm presence of her husband beside her. She rose and went about her day as she had done for almost 30 years, making breakfast, tending to her household, visiting with whichever family member stopped by, and planning the evening meal. It was ordinary and routine, and it was everything she had ever wanted. Because she had learned something important in her years on this Texas ranch. Happiness was not found in grand gestures or dramatic moments. It was found in the everyday rhythms of life, in the small acts of love repeated over and over, in showing up for the people you loved day after day, year after year. It was found in nursing sick children and celebrating their triumphs, in working side by side with your partner to build something lasting, in creating a home where everyone felt safe and valued and loved. Eleanor Foster Whitmore had come to Texas expecting only to teach 3 motherless boys and had ended up building an entire dynasty of love. She had loved those 3 sons like they were her own because they were her own in every way that mattered. And in loving them, she had found herself, found her true calling, found a happiness deeper and richer than anything she had ever imagined. As she stood at her kitchen window watching the sun rise over the land she loved, surrounded by the sounds and smells of home, Eleanor smiled. This was her life, the one she had chosen and built with her own 2 hands and her whole heart, and she would not trade it for anything in the world. The rest of Eleanor and Cade's years together passed with the sweetness that comes from a long and well-lived life. They saw all their children settled and happy, watched grandchildren grow up and start families of their own, and even lived to meet several great-great-grandchildren. The ranch continued to prosper under Kenneth's management, growing into one of the most successful operations in the region. The Whitmore name became synonymous with quality cattle, fine horses, and fair dealing. When Cade passed away peacefully in his sleep, at the age of 78, Eleanor was beside him, holding his hand, just as she had held it through all the years of their marriage. She grieved deeply, but she did not break. She had their children and grandchildren around her, and she had the satisfaction of knowing that she and Cade had lived fully and loved completely. Eleanor lived another 10 years, becoming the matriarch of a family that now numbered in the dozens. She spent her final years doing what she loved best, teaching the youngest grandchildren to read, telling stories about the old days, and reminding everyone that love was the most important thing, the foundation on which everything else must be built. When Eleanor Foster Whitmore passed away at the age of 75, peacefully in her sleep just like her beloved Cade, she was surrounded by family. Her funeral was the largest Llano had ever seen, with people coming from all over Texas to pay their respects to the woman who had touched so many lives. She was buried next to Cade on the hill behind the house, with Sarah Whitmore's grave nearby. The 3 of them, connected by love and loss and the family they had all contributed to creating, rested together overlooking the ranch that had been the center of all their lives. On Eleanor's headstone, placed there by her children, were these words: "Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, and friend. She loved us like we were her own." Because they were her own, every single one of them, bound together not just by blood but by the fierce and tender love of a woman who had come to Texas seeking only employment and had found instead a home, a family, and a love story for the ages. And so the story of Eleanor and Cade Whitmore became part of the Whitmore family legacy, told and retold to each new generation as an example of what true love looked like. Brave enough to begin again after loss, strong enough to weather any storm, and generous enough to embrace not just each other, but all the children who needed a mother's care and a father's guidance. Their love had created something that lasted far beyond their own lives, rippling outward through time in the lives of everyone they had touched. And that, more than any earthly success or material wealth, was the true measure of a life well lived and a love that would never die.